All Officer Dan Riley saw was a broken taillight. He had no idea he'd just pulled over the most dangerous man in the city. The man behind the wheel was calm, polite. He handed over his license without a word. He looked like any other tired businessman heading home late. Dan never noticed the two dark SUVs that had stopped a block back, their engines off. Dan glanced at the ID. Vincent Moretti, a name he didn't recognize. Just another driver on a quiet Thursday night. "Step out of the car, please," Dan said, trying to keep his voice steady. Routine, just a roadside test, nothing more. But for a man like Vincent Moretti, nothing is ever just routine. Vincent's eyes met Dan's, calm, measured, almost unreadable. He stepped out slowly, hands visible. Nothing about him screamed danger. And yet, the air around him seemed heavier, charged with something Dan couldn't name. "Evening, officer," Vincent said smoothly. "Everything okay?" Dan nodded, forcing a smile. "Just a quick balance test. Standard procedure." He didn't notice the subtle flick of Vincent's hand toward the back seat, or the faint hum that suddenly seemed to vibrate in the asphalt beneath their feet. Dan's heart beat a little faster as he gestured toward the side of the road. Vincent complied immediately, stepping onto the pavement like a man who already knew exactly how this encounter would end. Behind him, the SUVs remained perfectly still, their dark windows reflecting nothing, giving away nothing. This small test of balance was about to become the biggest mistake of Dan Riley's life, and light a fuse that would blow the city's underworld wide open. Vincent's calm demeanor never wavered, but Dan could feel it. The tension, the hidden threat. He had no idea that with one wrong move, his life could end before the taillight was even fully documented. Then Vincent spoke, and in those few words, Dan realized maybe he wasn't just stopping a tired businessman tonight. "Officer," Vincent said, voice smooth as silk, "do you always check a man for balance? Or is it just me tonight?" Dan swallowed hard. Something in that question didn't fit the routine. Something in the night itself seemed to pause, waiting. And in that pause, Dan had no idea what was coming next. Dan Riley's pulse was climbing, each beat echoing in his ears louder than the city's distant hum. Vincent Moretti's calm, collected voice had already set him on edge. Something about the way he moved, the precision in his eyes, screamed danger, but Dan couldn't place it. Not yet. Behind him, the two SUVs remained in the shadows, engines off, like predators waiting for the right moment. Dan didn't see the tinted windows shifting slightly, as if the occupants inside were watching every twitch of his fingers. "Balance test," Dan said, trying to keep his tone casual. "Just step on the line, raise your foot, arms out. Standard procedure." Vincent's lips curved faintly. Of course. He moved like a dancer, precise and smooth. Each step measured, almost too perfect. Dan forced a smile, telling himself it was routine, telling himself nothing could go wrong. But then he noticed it, subtle, almost imperceptible. The faint glint of something metallic in Vincent's jacket pocket. A badge? A weapon? Dan's hand twitched toward his holster. Before he could react, the SUVs shifted, a shadow detaching from the nearest vehicle. Dan froze. In the distance, he could see the silhouette of a man stepping out slowly, deliberately, hands hidden. "Sir," Dan started, but Vincent interrupted, calm as ever. "Officer Riley," he said, using Dan's name like a whisper in the dark. "You're about to make a mistake you won't forget. And not for the reason you think." Dan's stomach sank. How did this man know his name? His mind raced. Was it a setup? Surveillance? But before he could answer, his radio crackled to life. "Unit 12, we've got reports, static." And then nothing. Dan glanced down. The radio was dead. No signal. No help. Just Vincent. And the looming shadows of the SUVs. A chill ran down Dan's spine. This wasn't a simple roadside stop anymore. He was standing on the edge of something far bigger, far darker, and every instinct screamed at him to run, but he couldn't. Now while Vincent Moretti stood there, calm, untouchable. "Step carefully, officer," Vincent murmured, almost kindly. "Tonight isn't about your badge. It's about choices. Yours." And in that moment, Dan realized he was no longer in control. The night had shifted. The rules had changed, and he had no idea what the first move should be. Dan Riley's legs felt like lead. His eyes darted between Vincent Moretti and the two dark SUVs parked a block away, shadows melting into the night. Every instinct screamed at him that this was no ordinary stop, and for the first time, he wondered if he'd even make it out alive. Vincent's calm smile never wavered. "Officer," he said softly, "I think you underestimate the company I keep, and the company watching us right now." Dan's gaze snapped to the nearest SUV. The tinted window rolled down slightly. A pair of cold eyes stared back, unblinking, calculating. Behind that glare, Dan could feel the weight of a world he'd only heard about in whispered stories. Power, money, danger. A world ruled by Vincent Moretti. "What would you want from me?" Dan's voice cracked, betraying him. Vincent's smile deepened, almost amused. "I'm not here to harm you yet, but you're standing on the wrong side of a street that doesn't forgive mistakes. Every move you make tonight matters." Dan tried to steady his shaking hands, reaching for his radio again. Dead. Nothing. The SUVs shifted again. One door opened. Dan could now see the occupants, figures tall, broad, and silent. They didn't move like men. They moved like predators, trained to strike without hesitation. Vincent took a step closer, his calmness unshakable. "You see them, don't you?" he asked. "They don't like surprises, but they do enjoy mistakes." And Officer Riley, his eyes locked onto Dan's, sharp and cold. "You're about to make the biggest one of your career." Dan's heart pounded. He realized it wasn't just a roadside test anymore. It was a trap, a test, a warning. He was standing at the edge of something far bigger than himself, something that could destroy him in seconds. Then Vincent's phone buzzed. A text. One glance, and the man's expression hardened ever so slightly. Dan didn't know the words, but he felt their weight. "It's time." And in that instant, the air shifted. The night seemed to tighten around him. Dan's training, his instincts, his experience, all of it screamed for action. But he was no longer in control. He was a pawn in a game that had already begun, and Vincent Moretti was holding all the pieces. Every decision from here on would either save him or destroy him. And just like that, the routine had ended. Dan Riley's mind raced, his thoughts scattering like shards of glass. Every training exercise, every cautionary tale from the academy, none of it could have prepared him for this. He was standing on an ordinary street, a simple taillight violation, and yet here he was face to face with Vincent Moretti, the man who didn't just rule the city's underworld. He was the underworld. Vincent's gaze was steady, unflinching, but something in his posture hinted at a dangerous readiness. The SUVs weren't just parked. They were strategically positioned, engines silent but deadly, like wolves circling prey. Dan realized, with a sick twist in his stomach, that escape was almost impossible. "Officer Riley," Vincent said softly, "sometimes you don't get to choose the game. You just get to survive it." The words chilled him. Dan's hand hovered over his holster, but he knew instinctively that drawing his weapon would be suicide. One wrong move, and the SUV's occupants would act before he even thought. "Sir, if this is about your connections, I can," Dan started, but Vincent's raised hand stopped him. "It's not about me," Vincent said smoothly. "It's about you understanding the rules of this world. And tonight, you're on the wrong side." From the corner of his eye, Dan noticed the faint movement of shadows along the street. Figures were approaching silently, stepping from the darkness like ghosts. Their pace was deliberate, calm, trained. Dan's pulse accelerated. These weren't ordinary men. They were soldiers of a kingdom he didn't belong to. "Step back, sir," one of them whispered, almost too quietly to hear. But it was enough. Enough to remind Dan that his every choice mattered now, and mistakes would be fatal. Vincent took a step forward. You know, some men would panic here. They try to fight, to run, to prove themselves. But you're smart, Officer Riley. You understand there's no winning tonight. Only surviving. Dan swallowed hard. He had to think. One wrong word, one wrong glance. It could all be over in an instant. And yet, he couldn't just stand there. Not when the city's most dangerous man was watching, measuring, deciding his fate. Then it happened. The lead SUV's door slammed open. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, silent. He didn't speak. He didn't move with urgency, just confidence. Pure, lethal confidence. Dan felt the air tighten, as if the world itself had contracted around him. Vincent nodded subtly toward the man. "Detective Miller," he said, "I thought you might like to meet the people who make my nights easier." Dan's stomach dropped. Detective Miller? He'd heard whispers. An enforcer, someone who handled problems quietly, efficiently, without leaving a trace. And now he was here, watching Dan, evaluating him like a chess piece. Before Dan could react, the second SUV shifted. Another figure emerged, this one smaller, quicker, moving with uncanny precision. Dan's instinct screamed at him. These weren't just backup. These were hunters, predators who thrived on fear and calculation. Vincent's calm voice cut through the tension. "Officer, you have a choice. Comply and walk away tonight. Resist," and he let the threat hang in the air, heavy as lead. "Well, we wouldn't want anything bad to happen, would we?" Dan forced himself to stay calm. He had to assess to survive. I don't know what you want from me," he said carefully, his voice measured, even though every muscle in his body screamed tension. Vincent's eyes gleamed, almost with amusement. "Information, officer. Just a little insight into who thinks they're untouchable. And maybe a little entertainment." Then, in a motion so quick it was almost imperceptible, Vincent's hand moved. Not threateningly, not aggressively, but commanding. And the world shifted. The two figures from the SUVs moved instantly, their approach silent, precise, coordinated. Dan realized too late that they weren't just here to intimidate. They were testing him, watching how he reacted. Every twitch, every shift in posture, every heartbeat. Vincent's people knew. Dan's mind raced. Should he run? Should he fight? Should he comply? He tried to remember training. Every scenario drilled into him. But nothing had prepared him for standing alone, facing a man like Vincent Moretti and his silent army in the dead of night. And then Vincent spoke again, softer this time, almost like a whisper meant for no one but Dan. "You've got two choices tonight, officer. Step forward into the darkness, or step back and learn to live another day. But be careful. Sometimes stepping back isn't enough. Sometimes the night doesn't let you go." Dan felt a chill creep through him. And for the first time, he realized just how deep he had fallen into this world. The routine stop, the taillight, the harmless test of balance. Everything had been a lure. And now he was trapped. The street was silent except for the faint hum of the SUV's engines and the distant city noise. The shadows were closer. The night had grown heavy. And somewhere in the darkness, Dan knew, Vincent Moretti was smiling. Not just at him, at the city. At the chaos he was about to unleash. And in that moment, Dan understood one terrifying truth. He wasn't just facing a mafia boss. He was facing the storm itself. Dan Riley could feel his pulse hammering in his ears. Every instinct in his body screamed that he was on the brink of disaster. But he had no idea which direction the danger would strike first. The routine stop, the broken taillight, the polite exchange was gone. It had evaporated into the cold night air, replaced by something far more dangerous. Vincent Moretti. The city's lights flickered in the distance, but here, on this quiet street, the shadows were alive. Alive with intent. Alive with precision. Dan tried to convince himself that if he stayed calm, nothing would happen. But calm had no place in a storm like this. Vincent stepped closer, his presence magnetic and terrifying all at once. "Officer Riley," he said, voice smooth, velvety, dangerous. "The night is full of choices. You make the right one, and you leave here intact. You make the wrong one." His words hung, incomplete, but the threat was clear. Dan's mind raced. He knew that the two SUVs were more than mere bodyguards. These were enforcers, men trained to erase mistakes with deadly efficiency. One glance from Vincent's people, and Dan could be gone before anyone even noticed he'd been there. He tried to steady his shaking hands, focusing on breathing. "Stay calm. Think. Survive. Listen," Dan said carefully, choosing his words like steps on a frozen lake. I don't want trouble. I just want to finish this stop, okay? That's all. Vincent's eyes gleamed in the dim streetlight. Trouble? Officer, you're already in trouble. The question is, how deep are you willing to go before it's too late? Then came the faintest click, almost imperceptible. Dan's blood ran cold. A gun? Hidden in Vincent's jacket? Or perhaps the figure stepping silently behind him. The first SUV's door opened fully, and two more men stepped out. Tall, silent, wearing expressions that betrayed no emotion, only calculation. Every movement, every breath seemed choreographed. Dan realized he was outnumbered, outmatched, and out of options. He glanced at Vincent, searching for some hint of mercy. But there was nothing, only the calm, precise menace of a man who had orchestrated entire empires and destroyed anyone who stood in his way. Step aside, Vincent said softly, almost conversationally, and watch. Or step forward and learn something about the world you thought you knew. Dan's mind raced. Step aside? No, that's surrender. Step forward? That's death. He tried to read Vincent, to find some clue, some weakness, but the man was a fortress. Suddenly, the smaller figure from the second SUV moved faster, almost too fast to see. Dan's instincts kicked in, and he ducked, narrowly avoiding a blow aimed at him. A flash of steel caught the dim light. This wasn't intimidation anymore. This was a warning. A single strike, perfectly timed, could have ended him. Dan stumbled back, heart hammering, trying to process the impossible. Vincent, meanwhile, remained perfectly composed, almost bored. You see, Officer Riley, Vincent said, voice calm. Most men freeze when confronted with the real world. Most make mistakes they regret forever. You have a chance to survive, but only if you understand what survival really means. Dan swallowed hard. Survival. He thought about his family, his career, everything he'd worked for, and he realized that nothing mattered if he didn't make it through this night. Tell me what you want, Dan said, trying to sound steady. Just tell me. Maybe we can end this peacefully. Vincent smiled faintly, a predator enjoying the game. I don't want anything yet. Not from you. But the city, the streets, they're messy. And I like to remind people who really runs them. Tonight, officer, you're my messenger. Dan's stomach twisted. Messenger? What did that mean? Was he supposed to deliver a warning? Be a pawn? He had no choice, and yet he couldn't stop his mind from racing through the possible consequences. Then the sound came. A low hum, almost imperceptible at first, and then another. Engines revving quietly in the distance, too many to count. Reinforcements? Or more of Vincent's men? Dan realized with horror that he was surrounded, outnumbered, trapped. Vincent took a deliberate step back, surveying the street. Tonight, he said, voice echoing in the silence, the city learns a lesson about control, about fear, about who really decides what happens after dark. Dan knew he had to act, but what could he do? One wrong move, and he'd be gone. He weighed his options. Fight and die, comply and live, but live as a pawn, trapped in a world he didn't understand. The air grew heavy with tension. The night seemed to pause, holding its breath. Dan could hear his own heartbeat, loud and erratic, each thump a countdown. Then Vincent stepped closer, whispering, almost gently, into Dan's ear. Tonight, officer, you will see the city differently. You will understand power. And when it's over, you may never be the same again. And just like that, the night exploded. From nowhere, a figure darted out from the shadows. A third party, unannounced, unaccounted for. A gunshot cracked through the air. Dan dropped instinctively, adrenaline surging. Chaos erupted. Vincent's calm expression shifted slightly. A flicker of irritation or perhaps amusement. The enforcers reacted immediately, moving with deadly precision, their silhouettes cutting through the darkness like knives. Dan had no time to process. He rolled, scrambled, and ran for cover behind his patrol car, heart pounding, lungs burning. The world had become a battlefield overnight, and he was caught in the center, a man who had thought a broken taillight was the worst he'd face. Vincent's voice cut through the chaos, calm, unshakable. Remember, Officer Riley, nothing is routine. Nothing. And tonight, the streets will burn whether you want them to or not. Dan peeked out from behind the car. The SUVs were moving, the shadows shifting, the chaos unfolding like a storm he couldn't control. He realized the truth. The routine was over. The city's underworld had revealed itself in full force, and he was trapped in the eye of the hurricane. And at that moment, Dan knew this night would define him, or would destroy him. The night had transformed into a war zone. Dan Riley's patrol car was his only cover, but even that felt fragile under the weight of the chaos. Adrenaline coursed through his veins, his mind a whirlwind of fear, strategy, and disbelief. One minute he had been pulling over a car for a broken taillight. The next, he was in the center of the city's deadliest storm. Vincent Moretti stood a few feet away, calm, untouchable, like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of violence. The SUVs had moved, forming a tight perimeter, their occupants ready, lethal, silent. The shadowed street became a chessboard, and Dan realized with a sickening clarity, every move he made would be observed, judged, and exploited. The first gunshot had come, without warning, a sharp crack that cut through the night like ice. Dan had dropped instinctively, rolling behind the car. Sparks of light flashed from the darkness, reflections off steel, muzzle flashes from unseen weapons. He couldn't tell where the shots were coming from, only that survival depended on staying low, staying hidden, and thinking faster than he ever had before. Vincent's voice rang out above the chaos, eerily calm, almost conversational. "Officer Riley, you see what I live with every night. You see what the city really is beneath its shiny surface. And tonight you get a front row seat." Dan forced himself to breathe. Think. Observe. Survive. He scanned the scene. The SUVs had split their enforcers, covering every approach, moving silently, coordinated with deadly precision. The third figure, the unknown shooter, had disappeared into the shadows. Whoever it was, they were smart, lethal, and clearly not affiliated with Vincent. Dan's mind raced. This was no longer about a broken taillight. This was survival. This was being trapped in a storm of power, violence, and secrets. And he was in the eye of it. Suddenly, one of Vincent's enforcers moved like a shadow, closing the distance between Dan and him in a heartbeat. Dan raised his weapon instinctively, but hesitation froze his finger. This wasn't a random criminal. Every man here was trained, precise, and lethal. One wrong decision, and it was over. Vincent's calm voice cut through the night again. "Lower it, officer. Weapons are useless here. Strategy, observation, that's your only chance." Dan's eyes followed Vincent's gesture. Across the street, another figure emerged, moving quickly but calculated. Dan realized with horror that this wasn't a firefight. It was a test. Every move he made, every twitch of his muscles, was being recorded in the minds of the most dangerous men in the city. Time slowed. Every sound was magnified. The distant hum of engines, the soft shuffle of boots on asphalt, the faint metallic click of weapons being readied. Dan felt the weight of the night pressing down on him. Then Vincent stepped forward, unhurried, smiling faintly. "You see, Officer Riley, some people think power comes from fear. Others think it comes from money. But real power," he paused, letting the words hang like a blade above Dan's head. "Real power comes from control. And tonight, you are learning that lesson the hard way." The unknown shooter from earlier reappeared, aiming directly at Vincent's SUV. Chaos erupted again. Muzzle flashes lit up the dark street in brief, staccato bursts. Dan's heart pounded as the enforcers reacted with preternatural speed, neutralizing the threat almost before it had materialized. Vincent didn't flinch, not once. "See? This city is messy, unpredictable, but I am not." His gaze landed on Dan. "And neither are you, if you survive this night." Dan felt the weight of those words. Survival wasn't about courage. It wasn't about guns. It was about reading the storm, moving with it, staying one step ahead. Every instinct screamed for him to run, but he couldn't. Not yet. The enforcers spread out, securing the perimeter. The street had become a cage, walls invisible but impenetrable. Dan was trapped, alone, and exposed. Then Vincent moved again, closer now, his presence magnetic, terrifying, inescapable. Officer, you've been very brave. Or foolish. Perhaps both. But there's one final lesson tonight. He gestured toward the street. The city is a chessboard. And some of us are masters of the game. From the darkness, more figures emerged. Vincent's lieutenants, silent, disciplined, every move calculated. Dan realized that he was surrounded not just by men, but by an entire network of control, of influence, of fear. The city itself seemed to bow to Vincent Moretti. Dan's mind raced. He could try to fight, but that was suicide. He could try to flee, but the street was closed in every direction. His only option was to play along, to survive, to gather whatever information he could, and hope that by morning he was still breathing. Vincent smiled faintly, almost kindly, as if reading Dan's thoughts. Tonight, you will see what it means to be on the wrong side of the city. And when the dawn comes, Officer Riley, you may never look at this world the same way again. The unknown shooter moved again, firing into the darkness, creating a brief eruption of chaos. Dan ducked instinctively, heart hammering. But Vincent's calm remained unshaken. Every reaction was anticipated, every move countered. Dan realized something terrifying. He wasn't just witnessing a display of power. He was part of it. Every action, every thought, every decision was now under scrutiny. One mistake could cost him everything. And in that moment, Dan Riley understood the truth about Vincent Moretti. He wasn't just a mafia boss. He was a force of nature, a storm that consumed everything in its path. And tonight, Dan Riley was standing directly in the eye of it. The night stretched on, tense, silent, dangerous. Every breath, every heartbeat, every shadow was a threat. Dan knew that nothing would ever be the same, because after tonight, the city would burn, and he would either survive, changed forever, or be erased, leaving the streets to whisper the name of Vincent Moretti in fear and awe. The street was alive with tension. Every shadow seemed to breathe. Every sound, footsteps, distant engines, the faint hum of the city, felt amplified, as if the night itself were watching. Dan Riley crouched behind his patrol car, muscles coiled, heart hammering like a drum. He knew one thing with absolute clarity. Tonight, there would be no routine, no rules, no safety. Vincent Moretti stood a few meters away, calm, impossibly composed, his eyes glinting in the dim streetlight. Around him, his enforcers moved like shadows, silent but deadly. And somewhere beyond, the chaos of the unknown shooter, now neutralized, reminded Dan that the night had no mercy. Vincent's voice cut through the tension, smooth, almost conversational. Officer Riley, this city, it chews up men like you all the time. Brave men, clever men, men who think a badge protects them. But tonight, you're learning the hard way. Dan forced himself to breathe. He had survived this long by thinking, by observing, by staying calm in the eye of a storm that would have shattered most men in seconds. But survival was no longer enough. He had to act, and fast, before the night claimed him completely. Vincent took a step forward, the streetlight glinting off the silver cufflinks on his jacket. Here's the choice, officer. You can walk away, changed, enlightened, alive. Or you can test the storm and fail. Dan swallowed hard. He had only seconds to decide. He could feel the weight of the city pressing in. The unseen eyes, the quiet whispers of power, the lethal precision surrounding him. This wasn't about justice anymore. This was about survival. He made a decision. Dan sprang from cover, moving faster than he ever had in his life. He ran toward Vincent, not recklessly, but with calculated speed. His goal: close the distance, seize the moment of hesitation, and survive. Vincent's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in measured calculation. A faint smile appeared. Clever, he murmured. Very clever, Officer Riley. The enforcers reacted instantly, but Dan had predicted the pattern. Using their own precision against them, he weaved between the shadows, ducking, dodging, surviving. Every move was a gamble. Every heartbeat could be the last. Vincent didn't move to stop him. Instead, he watched calm, almost approving. "Let's see how you finish this, officer. Let's see what you're made of." The night exploded into chaos as Dan reached the center of the street. He grabbed the nearest enforcer by surprise, using him as a shield, and sprinted toward the SUVs. Bullets whizzed past, the city itself echoing with the sound of gunfire, footsteps, and the heavy tension of lives hanging by a thread. Then Vincent stepped forward, finally closing the distance between them. His presence was overwhelming, magnetic, terrifying. "Remember this moment," he said softly, his voice calm but deadly. "You survived. But the lesson is eternal. This city belongs to those who understand power, control, and patience." Dan skidded to a stop, chest heaving, adrenaline blazing. He was alive. Somehow, impossibly, he had survived. The enforcers froze, waiting for the command, but Vincent raised a hand. "Enough," he said. Silence fell like a heavy blanket over the street. Vincent's gaze met Dan's, piercing, unreadable. "Tonight, you've learned something most men never understand. The world isn't fair. The rules are illusions. And the city always remembers those who survive." Dan stared, still trembling, barely able to speak. You could have killed me," he whispered. Vincent smiled faintly. "I did not, because you showed potential, resourcefulness, courage, and perhaps respect for the game." He turned, motioning to the SUVs. The enforcers melted back into the darkness, leaving Dan alone on the street, gasping for breath, heart pounding, body trembling. The hum of the city returned, the night sounds resuming as if nothing had happened. But Dan knew better. The lesson was seared into him, permanent and undeniable. Vincent Moretti had revealed a world that existed beneath the surface of law, order, and ordinary life. And tonight, Dan Riley had survived it. But survival came with a cost. Dan looked at the street, the shadows, the emptiness left behind. He knew this night would haunt him forever. The memory of Vincent's calm menace, the silent enforcers, the sheer precision of power, it would stay with him, shaping every step he took in the city from now on. And somewhere in the distance, Vincent disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind only a whisper of danger, control, and inevitability. Dan Riley straightened, gripping his patrol car. The city had been quiet before this night. Now it had been marked. The underworld had revealed itself, and he had lived to see it. But one truth lingered in his mind, heavy and undeniable. Some streets are not meant to be walked alone. Some men are not meant to be challenged. And some nights change everything. The routine was gone. The city had burned. And Vincent Moretti would never be forgotten.